The Scarlet Plague is a fictional novel written in the 1915s. It takes place in post-apocalyptic U.S., specifically the California area, after a plague has wiped out just about all of the people on Earth, aside from our short cast. The cast consists of the Granzier, who is this old man that was around whenever the plague first took everybody out. Then we've got probably the most intelligent of the boys, Edwin, who was traveling with the Granzier at the start of the book. They're just sort of hunting, they make it to the beach, and they catch up with the other boys who have been watching their sheep with their two dogs. That's where we meet Hoo-Hoo and Hairlip. Uh, Hairlip being the one with the least patience out of all of them, but all of the boys still being savages. Not too long in, it sort of solidifies how savage they've become. They come across a skeleton on the beach and they immediately start ripping out the teeth to make necklaces. And this just sort of makes Gransier break down crying because the world used to be a beautiful place to him, and now the children have all reverted to being savages. At about this point is when Gransier starts telling the story of when the plague actually happened, and his experience from it after some arguments amongst the group, because Gransier uses very big words and the boys don't see any need for it, specifically Hairlip. He gets frustrated every time Gransier uses a very large word, or even the word scarlet, because scarlet to Hairlip is just another word for red. So Gransier begins his story explaining numbers at first to the children so they could understand just how many people died. He explains it to them by the means of their fingers, and then about how a pebble is worth all 10 of your fingers, and then I believe it was a grain of sand is worth 10 of the pebbles, and then a clamshell is 10 of the grains of sand, and so on and so forth, until he's able to explain to them just how many people died, because at this point, there's no education or anything. They don't exactly know how to count, per se. So he was explaining numbers to them, and then he begins with his story about how many people died and how his experience was. We learn that the Gransier, back whenever everything was, air quote, normal, was a college professor, and from his own words, a favorite of the students. They loved listening to his lectures. But one day while he was teaching, a student of his fell ill with the Scarlet Plague on the spot, dropped dead right there, and that was how he learned how quickly everything just sort of devolved. Shortly after that, he runs home. Everyone's panicking. There's already the starts of some riots in the streets because people are just dropping dead left and right of this plague. He goes home for a few days, but he seems to be fine. His brother comes to check on him, because they're planning on running away, and his brother's got the plague, but for some reason the Gransier is still perfectly fine, so the Gransier goes back to the college now and starts boarding things off with some 400 other people that decided to stay together. This doesn't last too long, as people start dying off because of incubation period based upon this plague. So they all decide, well, we've got to get moving, we got to get out of here, because at this point there's still countless people that are raiding, setting fires to things, rioting. So he starts heading off north, and slowly over time, everybody from his party dies off except for him. And this pony that they had picked up as an emergency food supply. So he takes this pony, he winds up finding two dogs that had not reverted back to being wild animals yet, and he finds another wild horse. So he has the pony carry his belongings, the two dogs there to protect him, and he rides the horse. He winds up holding up in a hotel for, I think he said, about 5 years. And then he starts heading back home because he desperately wants to know if anyone else survived, because the Scarlet Plague didn't affect him. It's at this point that he makes it back towards his home, and he finds two survivors, one of which is this abusive man called the chauffeur, and this woman that was really well known and respected beforehand. Her last name, I believe, is Van Bern. The chauffeur is very abusive to her. As it turns out, before the plague and everything, the chauffeur was one of her servants. And so this is his way of getting back at her. Now he's her husband, and he rules over everything and makes her do everything while he lays back and is relatively lazy. The Grand Seer really hammers home how terrible the chauffeur was, and how he couldn't manage to stay there any longer to see what the chauffeur was doing, and the chauffeur refused to let the woman go. So he followed the signs of other survivors and wound up joining up with their tribe of people, which happened to be much better off, much more polite. And it's right around here that he starts explaining all the different tribes of people that are still alive. They're not large numbers by any means. I believe his tribe exactly was 10 people at that time. And they're all named after the places where they are from. As a matter of fact, they thought that these were all the survivors in the entire United States until one person from, I believe it was Ohio, came to visit them and joined up for a while with his clan and then made their own tribe. The story itself trails off here as the Grand Seer is going back to reality and telling them, you shouldn't trust these random medicine men because they're not talking any real science. They're just selling you snake oil, basically. And this is where Hoo says that he wants to become one of those. Or Hairlip says he wants to become a sort of witch doctor kind of person. Hoo informs him that if Hairlip was ever to give him the wrong kind of medicine or to send the death stick and it not work, then he would kill him. And Edwin says, well, I'm going to sit here and learn everything I can from Grand Seer, learn about gunpowder, and then I'm going to rule over all of you with an iron fist. And this, of course, makes Grand Seer break down because he doesn't want the world to be evil anymore. He doesn't want it to be where it is, but he wants things to go back to a state of normalcy, of course. But at this point, Grand Seer is in his 80s. He's super old. And he knows that he's not going to live long enough to see anything really rebuild. And the story itself just sort of ends off here. I wouldn't call it a cliffhanger per se, but it's definitely something that I feel like could be continued. And that's about it for the plot.